Welcome to the Ghostly Gallery podcast, a place where we explore the world of horror in film, television, books, and popular culture. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Bruce Markison, and as always, I am joined by my co-host and producer extraordinaire, Tracy Asteria. Tracy, what's going on with you?
Not too much, Bruce. Getting into the swing of fall. Still trying to get used to the new addition in this household, who has now been named Pugsley Adams. So, just trying to get used to the new cat and the fall weather that's been giving us a little bit of a rough time so far. How's everything been going with you?
Good. I wanted to mention one thing about Pugsley the cat. I'm glad to see that character is getting a little bit of publicity. You know, so much has been made of the Wednesday Addams show on Netflix, and I saw the first season. It was excellent with Jenna Ortega, but you never hear much about Pugsley. Pugsley is always kind of overlooked, even in the films. He's kind of the secondary character. You know, you hear a lot about Uncle Fester, you hear about Wednesday, of course, Morticia and Gomez, but
right.
Pugsley needs a little bit of credit, I think.
I think so too. I think Pugsley added a ton of great, little one-liners and just his ambiance altogether. I thought he was a really great character. And turns out it's a really great name for a cat too.
Yeah, absolutely. On the original TV show, which I watched back in the day, it originally aired in the 1960s. I watched it on syndication in the 1970s. Actor named Ken Weatherwax played Pugsley. He has since passed away. And then Lisa Loring played Wednesday. She also died not that long ago. I had the pleasure of meeting her at one of the Scaricon conventions here in upstate New York. She was very nice. Talked to her, and I was a little bit stunned when I heard about her passing because when I saw her, granted it was a few years ago, she seemed to be in pretty good health, seemed to be okay, but both of the actors who played the children in that original TV show gone. The only surviving actor from the main characters is John Astin, who played Gomez. He's in his mid-90s. He's amazing longevity, and he is the one still with us. Carolyn Jones died in the early 1980s. She had cancer. She was actually working, I think, on a soap opera. It might have been a primetime soap opera at the time of her passing. She had a very good career in Hollywood. Of course, Jackie Coogan, he died a number of years ago. He played Uncle Fester, but John Astin, the only one left from that show.
Oh, wow. It was a great show. I remember watching it in reruns growing up as a kid, and I don't believe I've ever seen any of the movies that have been made, but I was in love with that TV series.
Yeah, I only saw the first movie that came out in the mid-90s. For me, the TV show is really where it's at. That original show was brilliantly done, as was the other show that ran at the same time, The Munsters, and then that really got butchered by Rob Zombie in a feature film a couple of years ago. The less I say about that, the better. All right. We go from Pugsley and the Addams family to this week's guest. Looking forward to speaking with a young horror writer named Brandon Wills. Brandon has been reading, writing, telling stories since he was old enough to pick up a book. Currently writes for Paranormality Magazine. He's a member of the Horror Writers Association and also West Virginia Writers Incorporated. Brandon's also a co-host on the Wild and Weird radio podcast. Many of his stories have also been featured on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights podcast network. And he is the author of the book, which has a great title, The Ouija Board Said It Was Hungry, 31 Terrifying Tales of Horror and the Supernatural. Brandon, welcome to the Ghostly Gallery. How are you?
Hey, everybody. I'm pretty good. How are you?
We're doing well. We're glad you could join us. You know, your interest in reading and writing horror, it began at a very young age. Where did this come from?
Mhm.
Was it from your parents? Was it from someone else in your family? Was it just a natural interest that was always there?
It was a combination of things. I had older cousins who were like 10, 15 years older than me, and they all loved the Jason and Freddy movies of the 80s and all those slasher flicks. But for me, as a little kid, I was banned from watching them. So, like,
Mm.
I remember sneaking and looking down the hallway and watching my dad watch one of the Chucky movies.
Hmm.
Kid, and like it terrified me so bad it gave me nightmares for years.
Really?
And yeah, and I had a morbid horror of Chucky until I was like 12 years old, probably.
Your parents basically said you're not to watch this stuff?
Mhm.
How'd you feel about that? Were you upset?
Well, like anytime they tell a kid they can't do something, they're going to want to try to do it, and it makes them feel more inclined to do that because you tell them not to. So I would sneak and watch these movies at my
Yeah.
friends' houses and stuff. So didn't really stop me.
And did your parents know you were doing this? Did they catch on to that?
No, but when I was like 16, they decided that he's old enough now, he can watch that stuff. But they still wouldn't let
Yeah.
me watch like really bad ones like Last House on the Left or like the really really graphic ones.
It's interesting when you look back at childhood and how things go when we're young and how we sometimes maybe rebel against our parents. So obviously your parents were not big fans of horror. Was there anyone else in your family, cousins or uncles, that were really into the genre?
Yeah, I actually had an older cousin who was actually a preacher who really loved horror. It's a strange combination, but he loved horror. He actually let me borrow his VHSs and DVDs and stuff like that when I was growing up. So I remember I would borrow like one of the Friday the 13th movies, and then I would take it back like a video store and exchange it for another one. And I was just like consuming them, especially around Halloween.
Yeah. You mentioned you saw Chucky and then Friday the 13th. What was your first horror film ever that you saw? Do you remember that?
It was probably the first Halloween.
No, that's
My
a good
very
one.
first Halloween.
Yeah.
Very first scary movie, yeah.
How old were you when you watched that?
I was probably like 12 or 13. I remember when AMC used to do Monster Fest back in the day. It was one of the movies that came on it was probably like 2002.
Yeah.
That one, I think, was when they aired that.
I would think at 12 or 13, that's a pretty scary movie to watch.
Yeah, well, it was the TV version, so it wasn't as bad.
Yeah. When they first broadcast that on network TV, it was the early 80s. NBC did a broadcast. I want to say it was on Halloween night. And I think that year Halloween fell on a Saturday. And they aired the film, may have cut some of it, but most of it was there. And I remember watching it for the first time because I didn't see it in the theater. And I was just mesmerized. It was so good, so compelling, so scary. Watching it at night. I think there was only one other person in our house at the time. My parents, I believe, were traveling. They were travel agents, so they were often on the road. And it really, it kind of got to me in a good way. I mean, I think it didn't overwhelm me in terms of being terrifying, but it did give me a good scare, and I could see, why there was so much hype about it and why it did so well at the box office. And that was actually the first time that it ever aired. It was on NBC network. It was not on, HBO. HBO tended to get those films first, but NBC was able to get its hands on Halloween and show it. And it was, as it turned out, to be a pretty famous airing of it. Brandon, let's talk about some of your favorite authors, some of whom you, I'm sure, read growing up. And let's begin with a guy that is very well known for writing for children. That's the prolific R.L. Stine, who's still writing to this day. He has done such good work in writing horror stories for children. Given that he does write for a younger audience, was this an early author for you to read?
Yeah, believe it or not, I wasn't banned from reading those books as a kid. So like it was pretty well, since I wasn't allowed to watch other sorts of horror, this was the scariest thing I was allowed to indulge myself with. So it terrified me.
Yeah.
I can remember having nightmares after reading some of those books.
I have not myself read many of the
Mhm.
Stein books. I've read maybe one or two. I certainly know that he delves into a lot of different themes. Do you have a favorite book story that he has written?
Yeah, recently he actually did an adult horror book that was actually pretty good. It's called Red Rain.
Mm,
If you've never read that one, it's pretty good.
yeah,
I'm actually surprised that hasn't been made into a movie yet because it would be an excellent film.
yeah. What's it about?
It's about two twins who have these psychic powers, and I don't want to ruin the plot, but all kinds of bad things start happening once they start getting into their powers.
Yeah. When you read that his books for children, you were
Mhm.
young, and did that must have made it a lot easier for you to get through it? Because I know sometimes as kids, we try to read stuff that's beyond us. Like I tried to read Dracula when I was like 10 or 11, and I just wasn't
Mm.
ready for it. But with
Mhm.
Stein, I imagine that was so readable for you that it just sort of drove your interest further.
Yeah. Speaking of Dracula, I didn't really get into that book either until I was like 25. Man, once you get past the the chapters where he's describing the Romanian scenery and stuff, once you actually get to where he gets to the castle and meets Dracula, oh, it really just starts rolling after that.
Yeah.
It's still an excellent book to this day.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Another writer that you've really enjoyed, and a lot of us have, is the great Stephen King. He's the master of horror of all the authors
Mhm.
over the last 50 years. He's at the top of the list. What was the first King novel that you read?
I think it was Pet Cemetery was the first one that I read, and now that I have children, I don't think I can go back and reread that one.
Yeah.
But I've tried to watch the movie, and it's tough to watch as a parent. It
Oh,
really
sure.
is.
Sure.
I think that's what he was trying to. What the point of that book kind of was to try to hit that nerve because he had just recently had children of his own by that point in his life. His kids were all really little. They were like between babies and like kindergarten age at that point. So I think he was trying to write something that would horrify him too.
When you read that book at a young age, what went through your mind?
Mhm. I think that was one of the points where I decided that I wanted to write
Hmm.
because I was like, I started coming up with ideas in my head as I was reading it. And I was like, oh, it would be great if this would happen, if that would happen. Is this what's going to happen? And then when it didn't happen, I would be like, oh, maybe I should, write something like that.
So that really motivated you. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How about some other Stephen King books? I'll tell you a couple of personal favorites for me. Really, two of his early books, Carrie, which was his first horror
Mm-hmm.
novel, and then Salem's Lot, which came out shortly thereafter. So those are two that rank high on the list. I've been meaning to get to Pet Cemetery. I've seen all the films, but I haven't read the book yet. And I know people have told me, including yourself, how great it is. But what about you? What about some
Mm-hmm.
other Stephen King favorites on your list?
Salem's Lot's definitely up there. I remember I read that one. It was around Halloween of 2007, I think. Yeah, I believe I read that whole book in one night. I
Oh,
Really?
just could
wow.
not stop reading it. Yeah. Um, that had a big impact on me. It actually, still to this day, I still want to write a vampire novel, but like I keep comparing it to Salem's Lot every time I try to start something. I'm
Yeah.
like, that's not as good as Salem's Lot. He did an
No.
excellent job doing a modern day take on Dracula with that book. He really did.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Bringing Dracula to America, essentially.
Hmm.
Where
Yeah,
were
when he wrote that book, he actually thought it was garbage and he threw it away.
really?
Yeah, his wife found it in his trash bin, and she started leafing through it, and she said, "Hey, you've got something here. Don't throw it away." So he did a few edits on it, and eventually took off when he published it.
Wow, did not
Oh
realize that.
gosh. Oh, me
hmm
neither. Have you seen the Salem's Lot movie?
I've seen the original. Yeah, the original was fantastic. The remake was
Mhm.
okay. I didn't really mind the changes all that much. I
Mhm.
know people flipped out about it, but I was like, I get what they were doing. They didn't want to do a complete remake of the original. They wanted to add a little twist onto it, which was
Right.
actually kind of interesting. I haven't seen the sequel to that one yet, though.
Oh, there's a new one coming out on Bruce, is it HBO Max? Is that where the
Yes.
new one will be coming out? Yeah,
hmm
in October. I believe it's like at some point in October. Are you going to be keeping your eyes open for that one?
Yeah, I might check it out. I know that the original Pet Cemetery had a sequel, and it was
I agree.
Yeah, Pet Cemetery 2 was not anywhere near up to the standard of the first one. Then they did the remake
oh no.
just a couple of years ago. Any other Stephen King books that really hit home with you?
Yeah, The Green Mile did. I remember when I read that one, I actually cried at the end when John Coffey was executed.
Mhm.
But that book, it is that scene is far worse than the movie. I'll just say that.
Yeah.
It was far more sad, but the movie's excellent though. I love the movie.
On the day that we're recording, which is September 8th, this actually marks the anniversary of one of King's most prominent books. It was Cujo that came out on
hmm
this day in 1981. Did you read that one?
I have not read that one, but I've seen the movie a few times. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the movie. Dee Wallace is great in
hmm
that. Brandon, let's talk about another author that you really like. And he's a guy I have to admit I'm not familiar with. His name is Brandon Sanderson. Tell us a little bit about him.
He has created this really complex world in the fantasy genre. It is it's not quite as complex as what Tolkien was trying to do, but it is pretty complex. But I love it though. It's just there's so many characters. There's a whole he created a whole religion for that series. It's based a little bit off Mormonism since he grew up as a Mormon, but it's got its own differences there. But it is just such a good series. Uh, there's um, there's a teenage version, a young adult series that he's done. It's called Mistborn, which is what everyone recommends that you get started with. But I didn't. I went with the harder series, of course.
Yeah.
But I love it. It's just, and he has a new book coming out in December, and I'm excited for that one.
What's that book?
Oh gosh, let me see. It is the last. So what he's doing with the adult fantasy is he's going to divide the series into sections, and this is the end of the first section. So I'm like dreading to see if a main character is going to die, because at least one of them is going to, because it's fantasy.
Yeah. So all of his books are linked?
Yeah, they're all in the same universe. Oh, it's called Wind and Truth is the
Okay.
name of the new book.
I'm curious, Brandon, when you look at your own writing style that you have developed,
Mhm.
do you think you're borrowing from any or all of these authors that we
Oh yeah,
mentioned?
at least a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In what ways?
With Stephen King, I love the way that he does character development, the way he fleshes out his characters. He makes them really relatable, because you can always pinpoint them to either yourself or somebody that you know. Like, oh yeah, I know a guy like that. I knew a guy like that when I was growing up. That creepy guy down the road, that kind of relation. That's what I want to do. I want to create characters that people can, yank them out of the book and pull them into real life. That's one of my goals. And then with Sanderson, the way that he does world building is something that I really want to do. I eventually want to write a fantasy book, but that genre, you have to do so much now because people have such high expectations.
So, Brandon, when you first started your writing journey, did
Mhm.
you have anyone that you could turn to for either guidance or advice or a role model of sorts that you would look up to?
um, nobody that I actually spoke with for a long time. I was just writing things and keeping them. I wasn't
Mhm.
showing anybody. I wasn't posting them anywhere. It wasn't until I discovered that you could go on Reddit and submit things. I eventually worked up the nerve to do that, and that was actually how I met the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights podcast, was because of my submissions. They reached out to me through there, and I sent them some of my stories, which was back in 2016 now, when we first got in contact.
Mhm.
So that was how that happened. Yeah, before that, like, nobody saw any of that stuff because I had just like such low confidence with writing. I was just writing just to write, basically, at that point. It was
Oh
like
my
just
gosh, yeah.
practice.
So what about now? Are you is there like a close-knit group of like a writing community that you
Yeah.
participate in? Oh, is there?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got fellow writers that I'll show stuff to, but I also have beta writers that we call them, or beta readers that we call them,
Mhm.
people who read your stuff before it's ready, and they'll show you like errors that you might have missed, or like give you tips on what they think should be done. In the end, it's about, making your readers happy, not just yourself. Because if you want somebody to buy your stuff, you got to make the readers happy. So,
Oh, wow. Oh, no, that's pretty good. And do you have any, like, from your personal experience, do you have any advice or anything that you would give like new readers that are just getting started on their own journey?
yeah, Stephen King's a great start because he is basically what everyone from the last 50 years has drawn as their main inspiration. So if you really want to, look at the giant that we're all standing on the shoulders of, it's Stephen King. And you also have Dean Koontz. Dean's good too. Dean is
Absolutely.
a little easier to read in some ways than Stephen is. He's like, I don't want to like take him down a notch or anything, but he's just a little easier to read sometimes than Stephen is.
Yeah, they're both really great authors. I
Mm.
enjoy them both myself.
I think Dean
Absolutely.
should have a lot more films made from his books than what has been made so far. That's just my opinion.
Yes. Well, you never know what's going to happen in the future,
Mm.
right?
Brandon, you mentioned not having confidence a few years
Mhm.
ago. How do you feel now? You feel a lot more confident now?
I feel more confident, yeah, because I've been signed twice now. The first publisher went under, so I'm waiting on a new publisher to pick up that book. So right now I just have the one out because of that. But the way that you should look at it is, hey, the publisher assigned me, so apparently I'm at least somewhat good.
Yeah. I want to talk about that experience a little bit later on, but let's talk about your
Mhm.
book that is out there. It is available. The Ouija board said it was hungry. First off, I
Mhm.
love the title. Did you come up with that, or was that on the publisher side?
That was actually the name of one of the short stories, and I spent like a few weeks debating on what to call the collection. And then I think it was my wife who said, "Why not just use the name of one of your stories?" And that was always one of my favorite titles that I ever came up with, was that one. So that's also one of my most popular stories. Um, it's been on, it was on that podcast, Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and it was so popular that people like started requesting for a sequel, which I haven't done yet, but that's the only time that's happened so far.
Yeah. There's 31 stories in this anthology.
Mhm.
Are they all written by you, or is it a mix of different writers?
Oh yeah, it's all me. A lot of those stories are the ones that I didn't show anybody. So uh, I went back and rewrote a lot of them because they were actually pretty bad. So,
Yeah.
looking back now, so I spent like a month rewriting a lot of them, and just adding my newer style to it. And I thought about adding maybe in a future version, and a lot of authors do this now. They'll add like notes for each story of like what inspired them, what it was like when they were writing them, stuff like that. So that might happen in a future release.
That's impressive to me. 31 stories. You're a young guy. You've been doing this for a while, but not as long as some other people. I mean, that's a lot. I couldn't imagine writing 31 short stories, and you've compiled that many. I assume you have others too. That's pretty darn good.
Oh yeah, I have a lot more than that. A lot of them aren't finished. So, I have a big folder in my writing folder. It's just called Work in Progress, and there's probably at least 30 more just sitting in there that I haven't finished yet.
Yeah. What are the kinds of themes that you feature in the book? And when I say themes, I'm talking about ghosts, monsters, serial killers. What exactly do you tackle?
There's a little bit of every kind of horror in there. I try not to do anything too graphic. I don't feature like any assaults or anything like that in my stories. I don't go that extreme with it. It's just like it's nothing more extreme than, I know I'm going to say Stephen King again, but nothing more extreme than what he's ever written.
Yeah. So you've got ghosts, you've got vampires, maybe werewolves. Of all those subgenres, what do you really like to do the most?
Honestly, monsters are one of my favorite things to write about because as a kid, those were my favorite like horror stories and R.L. Stein books. I've always just loved creature features.
Yeah.
Now I was allowed to actually watch the old black and white horror movies from like the 50s and 60s. I was allowed to watch those as a kid, like Creature from the Black Lagoon, the old Dracula movies with Christopher Lee, those movies.
Yeah.
I was allowed to watch all those, and I would just eat those up. Even the B movies with I can't remember the name of it. There was one with giant ants.
Oh yeah.
This really terribly made ant puppet that was like crushing a city and stuff. I can't remember the name of that movie. And I remember one had a giant Gila monster.
Oh yeah.
The stuff they used to show on Monster Fest all the time back in the day.
Yeah. Do you create your own kinds of monsters, or do you borrow from monsters that have already been written about?
It's actually pretty hard to come up with something that's never been done. So sometimes, I just say, screw it. I'm going to just write a werewolf story. I'm going to write a vampire story today. It's really, really hard. But the thing is that you can do one of those old tropes and then put your own spin on it.
Mm-hmm.
Like what Stephen did with Salem's Lot. Like he did his own spin on the Dracula story, and it's still one of his most popular books to this day.
Yeah. I was noticing on Amazon that your book has received a lot of reviews, most of them very favorable. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that was a confidence booster for sure, because most of those reviews were not people that I sent copies of to. They were just people from the general public who left those reviews on their own. So that was very nice.
Yeah. Do you read them all?
Yeah. I try to respond to all of them too.
Do you really? The few negative ones that you've gotten, how do you feel about that?
That's okay. You can't make everybody happy.
Yeah.
I try, if it's a constructed criticism, I'll look at it and try to figure out if it's actually a good criticism or not, or if they're just being mean.
Yeah.
Most of the time on the internet, they're just being mean spirited because they do that to get their own kicks.
Right. And they tend to use false names or anonymous postings, that sort of thing. Anything that's been written critical of this book that you can look to and say, yeah, maybe that person's right. I can learn from that.
The only thing that I was taking into consideration was some people said that it was just too thick. There's just too many stories. So my next collection will definitely be smaller.
Really?
Yeah, that's about
31 doesn't seem too much to me. I've read anthologies with more than that.
Yeah, well, it's the people that are like in my generation. They have shorter attention spans,
yeah.
or the young. Actually, it's the ones younger than me that have the shorter attention spans because they're used to 30-second videos on TikTok and stuff like that, and they want to jump from one thing to the next real quick. So they're mostly the ones who've complained about it.
Right.
It's actually in the horror genre, it's the shorter books that are selling better than the longer books nowadays. It used to be the other way around back in like the 70s and 80s. Like Stephen King, Dean Koontz, they were churning out like 500-600 page books back to back. But nowadays it's like 150 to 200 page books that are selling more.
Have you ever used a Ouija board, Brandon?
Yep.
Oh, did you have any cool experiences with that?
No,
No.
no. I think it was because my girlfriend at the time wasn't into it. She was just being goofy about it. So like, I think that's probably why nothing happened. But I
Right.
had a cousin who had a horrible experience with it, and he refuses to even look at one now.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, a Ouija board is like one of those things, you either love them or you hate them.
Hmm.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's interesting.
my mom's very religious, and she doesn't even want one of those in her house. So,
Yeah, I can understand. I have a friend who actually collects Ouija boards. I think he's got over 50 of them, and one is supposedly very haunted and very evil. He actually keeps it out in his backyard in a shed, all locked up and, wrapped up in a special protection binding. So, yeah, I totally feel that.
yeah, there was actually a city not far from me that they used to actually make a special kind of Ouija board back in the 1800s. I'm trying to look up the name of it right now, but they're actually highly sought after because they didn't make very many of them.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they were very unique too. The guy who actually made it, his tombstone is actually fashioned like a Ouija board.
Oh,
His
wow.
name is yeah, his name is Elijah Bond. You want to look up
Oh
his
my God.
tombstone?
I can't even imagine walking through a cemetery and seeing something like that as somebody's headstone.
Okay, it was called the Kennard Novelty Company. Is what that was called. So if
Okay.
you collect Ouija boards, you probably know what I'm talking about.
Oh, interesting. I'll have to look that up. Thank you.
Hmm.
You were telling us, Brandon, a few moments ago about the other book that you have written. It's complete. It was all set to go to publication, and then something happened. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it actually had been out for a few months, but the old publisher folded, and a new publisher bought them, but they just haven't re-released that one yet. So I'm still waiting to get the word on when that's coming back out.
So there
But
are a
it's
few
not
of those books
available.
out there.
Yeah, yeah. They sold like, gosh, not very many. Like 30 hard copies was sold.
And what is that book? Is that also an anthology?
Yeah, it's a shorter one. It doesn't have very many. I think there were only like 15 stories in that collection. Because I was listening to the criticisms of people. Because this collection, the Ouija board set was Hungry. I actually self-published that first, and it had the same amount of stories, and people were complaining about it being too long. So I made a smaller collection, and that publisher picked it up, and then they folded. And then a new publisher saw my self-published collection and wanted that one. So
Mhm.
I signed the rights over for that, and it just came out. It's a little confusing, but
Yeah. You optimistic you'll be able to find someone else to publish that?
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a new company that took over. They bought all the rights for the books that the previous publisher had. They just haven't got the wheels turning on it yet to get everything republished.
I love the cover art on the Ouija board said it was Hungry. Who did that for you?
Mhm. It was an in-house artist for the publisher. They didn't tell me who it was, but they just said they have an in-house artist that makes all their covers. I thought it was great too.
Yeah. Very eye-catching. Very
Hmm.
fierce. I think exactly the kind of cover that a horror author would like to
Hmm.
have. One other thing related to writing, Brandon, that I wanted to ask you about is one of the subgenres of writing that you indicated to us that you're interested in. It's called splatterpunk, and I have some vague ideas of what exactly it is, but there may be some listeners who don't know what that is, maybe not have not heard about it. What exactly is splatterpunk?
Splatterpunk is sort of like the slasher film genre of horror books. It's more about the kills and the shock factor than it is the overall story. It's basically like that. It's like oh gosh, what's the name of that movie? Demon House, I think it was called. No, Night of the Demons from the 80s. Remember that movie?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of like that where there's really hardly any plot. It's just about the shock factor and the kills and trying to be as extreme as possible to shock your audience is what that genre is basically like. Now there are a few exceptions where some authors have put together something that has actually a good story and a lot of shocking scenes, but most of them they just want that shock factor only whenever they're writing something.
So very graphic, very extreme.
Yeah, sort of like what Grindhouse was trying to do in the 70s with their films, like just trying to do something as shocking as possible to push the envelope as far as they could.
Do you write any
What that genre's
splatterpunk,
kind of-
or you simply like to read it?
I don't. I haven't dove into that genre yet, but I like reading it. I just like to. I read as much as I can in horror just to get a feel for what's popular these days and try to. Everything I read, I take at least a little bit of it and add it to my own stuff, just as like growth. So I just try to read as much as I can.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
It kind of goes back just a little bit, little bit. I was wondering if you could just chat for a few minutes about the Wild and Weird radio podcast that you co-host. I heard it's about like paranormal stories. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's we examine just about every topic you can think of within the paranormal realm, like Bigfoot, aliens. We've talked about demons lots of times and witches, and my favorite is folk stories, stuff like local legends, stuff like that. Every little town has a story, and they all have their own little unique spin on things. Like you'll hear about the witch who lived down the road from your grandma, who used to have, like, their house cats would disappear or something. They would blame it on the little witch down the road, stuff like that.
Right.
I love those little stories. Actually wrote one that was vaguely based off of a folk story that I heard from my hometown when I was a little kid, but it's not been published anywhere yet. But it's as a kid, my mom used to tell me to be a good kid, or Bloody Bones was going to come take me out of my bed at night. And Bloody Bones was a skeleton who had blood all over him for some reason, and he would come through your window and take you away if you were a bad kid.
Oh, that would be terrifying.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Have you ever had any personal experiences with the paranormal?
Oh yeah, I've had a lot.
Oh,
My
can you
grandma's
share
house
something?
was pretty haunted when I was a kid.
Oh, really?
Yeah, especially the room that I stayed in. It was an old coal camp house. They were just like these little makeshift shacks that the coal companies would make their employees so they could stay in them.
Right.
And they didn't even have a hallway. You would have to walk through one room through another to get through the house. And I can remember one night there was a sitting room that sat directly in front of the bedroom that I stayed in, which connected to the living room. And I heard footsteps walking, like pacing back and forth, like somebody was, doing chores or something, just walking back and forth. And this was at like midnight or so. It was pretty late. And I remember I eventually got the nerve to open the door, and there was nobody there. And sometimes stuff in the bedroom would move around. I'd wake up, and she had like a chair that had dolls sitting in it, and the chair would be spun around.
Oh, wow.
Or she had a potpourri pot that had like a little trigger on the power cable. You had to flip it to turn it on. It would be turned on, and stuff like that. And I remember one night I was going to sleep, and I heard somebody whisper my name directly into my ear, and I could actually feel their breath on my ear whenever they said it. I found out years later in my 20s that my grandfather's aunt actually owned that house, and she willed it to him when she passed away. And she used to rent that room out to coal miners who didn't live there. They would just stay there during the week and then go home on the weekend. And 2 men actually died in that room.
Oh.
Both of them died of heart attacks. So.
Oh, that's kind of scary. Oh, that's kind of creepy. I actually live in a really small town in Nova Scotia, and it's an old mining community, coal mining community. So I know exactly the kind of little houses that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
There's still tons of them around here. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I drive by them and I'm like, I bet you there's so many stories to some of those houses.
Oh, I bet. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh gosh. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm quite into the paranormal, and so was Bruce. So we love hearing those kinds of stories.
Absolutely. Brandon, you live in an area of the country, West Virginia, where these kinds of stories kind of seem to gravitate to, right?
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but this state just seems to be a magnet for the weird.
Yeah.
Got Mothman, which is like 20 minutes from where I live at. And then there's also the Flatwoods Monster, which is about an hour away. That's one that people are starting to notice more often now.
What's
And
that? What's the Flatwoods Monster?
so it was these kids were playing on their school playground one day, and they saw a bright object come out of the sky and appeared to crash off in the distance. So they all get the nerve up to go check it out. So they go through a pasture onto this farmer's property, and they go up the mountain to investigate. And this 9 foot tall creature that was hovering off the ground that had glowing red eyes and looked like it was wearing like a green cloak of some kind with the hood pulled up was approaching them, and it had this noxious gas coming out of it that was making some of them physically ill. And it was just getting closer and closer to them. And when the shock wore off, they ran away. But nothing was ever seen of that again.
Interesting. The Flatwoods Monster. So these are the kinds of things you talk about on your Wild and Weird Radio podcast. And that's on YouTube, correct?
Yep, it is.
How many
It's
episodes?
on all the platforms.
How many episodes roughly have you done?
Oh, gosh, there's like over 200 now,
Wow.
I think.
That's great. So definitely check that out on YouTube, the Wild and Weird Radio podcast. Brandon, one final area we'd like to talk to you about is kind of your general love of horror in films and TV series, in addition to obviously your love of various writers and your love of writing itself. Let's start with some movies that really have hit home with you. And you were telling us that one of your favorite directors, the late, great George Romero.
Yeah, Night of the Living Dead was, I think that was the first zombie movie that I ever saw, which I guess that's a good starting point.
Sure.
I think that was on one of the Monster Fest, actually, where I saw that. And just ever since I saw that movie, I was just in love with the zombie genre. And I still want to write a really good zombie story to this day. At one point, I actually was in the process of doing a zombie film with some friends of mine, but that just didn't happen.
Did you see his follow-up, Dawn of the Dead?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Some people like that even
hard
better.
To find. Yeah, I think it actually is better, but, Night of the Living Dead just has that legacy with it. I mean, it just took off the zombie genre, and basically it hasn't changed since that movie. It's still sort of pretty similar to that. And all the movies made sense. I've basically just been ripping that one off.
Yeah. If there were one horror film that you would put at the top of the list, the one film that you like to see over and over again, what is it?
Probably that one. My daughter is 4 years old, and she's watched that movie with me.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. She loves it. Occasionally she'll be like, I want to watch zombies. Okay, here we go. We'll turn on Shudder.
Oh my gosh. Does she find it scary, or she just loves it?
She just loves it. She even recently started playing zombie games on my Xbox. She found that I had a zombie game on there, and she likes shooting the zombies now. So
yeah. That's wonderful. Let's talk about some TV series. Are you a fan of any of the vintage TV shows like Dark Shadows or Kolchak the Night Stalker? Or do you like some of the more recent shows that are now available on streaming?
I like the old ones. The Twilight Zone. I remember watching that as a kid, and that just had a big impact on me. some of the ones especially did, like the Monsters to Do on Maple Street had a big impact on me with my writing style, because that one is really not about the monsters; it's about the characters.
Right.
And a lot of people don't realize that, but it's monsters really don't show up at all until the very, very end of that one.
That's right. Yeah.
Which, it's about the people turning on themselves from just sheer chaos and panic. And I think it says a lot about society too. That's one reason why that episode really sticks out to me.
We're all very quick to point the finger at other people. That's something that that episode really shows up. Claude Akins, a great actor, is in that episode. Hey, that's a great starting point. If you like the Twilight Zone, you're a hit with me, man.
I actually liked some of the ones from the recent remake that they did of that series. Some of those episodes weren't too bad.
The Jordan Peele series?
Yeah, that one was actually pretty good. I was a little disappointed that they canceled it because now some of them were a little, on the cuff of just like trying to be. They were really shooting for political correctness on some of those episodes, but they took the old episodes and just twisted them around to not be as offensive. But I don't think you should do that because it takes away the original impact of the stories if you change them that much.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? There was the one of, I can't remember the name of the episode, the one with the gremlin on the plane.
Oh, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. That's a great one.
Yeah. That one, they actually did a pretty good version of that one. My favorite version, though, out of all the remakes was the one from the movie in the 80s. That was fantastic.
Yeah. Brandon, final question before we let you go. What is up next for you? What's your next writing project that you're either working on now or will be working on shortly?
I am actually working on a novel that is based off of a true crime story not far from me in Fayetteville, West Virginia. There was a family whose home caught on fire. They were called the Sauter family. And most of their children just disappeared in the house fire. They never found their remains or anything. And to this day, they're still classified as missing because there's no evidence that they were killed or died in the fire or anything. There's just nothing. So I just wanted to do a horror spin on that story and also kind of bring awareness to the real life story of what happened to them. And hopefully maybe one day we'll get answers.
Yeah. So this will be your first novel.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Very good. Again, our guest has been horror writer Brandon Wills. His book, The Ouija Board Said It Was Hungry, 31 Terrifying Tales of Horror and the Supernatural, can be found at Amazon.com. It's got a lot of great reviews there. And you can also hear Brandon on a couple of different podcasts. One of them, Wild and Weird Radio on YouTube. Also, the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights podcast network. Brandon, we really appreciate it. Good talking to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It was fun.
It was fun indeed. We appreciate Brandon Wills joining us on this edition of the Ghostly Gallery podcast. We'll take a short break, and then when Tracy and I come back, we'll reflect back on the recent passing of the man who directed the 1972 cult classic Blacula. We'll also talk about a film that was filmed in Cooperstown, not far from where I'm talking to you from right now. It's a film that was done back in 2021, just released on Shudder less than a month ago. We'll talk about those topics when we come back on the Ghostly Gallery. Welcome back to the Ghostly Gallery podcast. Again, our thanks go out to horror writer Brandon Wills, talking about the book that he's done and some of his podcast work as well. In our few remaining minutes, wanted to touch upon a couple of other topics, Tracy. One of them, some sad news that came down to us on August the 30th. Our friend Toothpickings, Brian Forrest is his real name. And he has been a guest with us a couple of times already. And he revealed something on August 30th that nobody had mentioned at all And I'm going to read to you part of what Brian wrote on Facebook. I waited a while to post this, but I think it's time for it to be public. William Crain, director of Blacula, passed away peacefully on June 22nd, 2024, in Tarzana, California. Crain also directed the feature film Dr. Black and Mr. Hyde, as well as episodic television, including Starsky and Hutch, Matt Houston, and the Mod Squad. Crain began his career in the theater working with James Baldwin before becoming an actor and stunt driver in Canada. He moved back to LA, where he hosted a jazz radio program and went into a junior directing program. Skip ahead a little bit now, and this is what Brian writes. In 1971, producer Joe Nahr hired Crain for his first feature, Blacula, penned by Joan Torres and Raymond Koenig. The film was incredibly influential and a major financial success, almost single-handedly saving its production company. Crain wasn't hired for the sequel to Blacula, and the sequel is poorer for his absence. In fact, he never watched the sequel until I screened it for him in 2022. Needless to say, he shook his head a lot at plot points while admitting that the performances and production value were strong. Brian goes on to write, I'm proud of the short documentary on Crain that I'm wrapping this year, that I hope to get out to film festivals in 2025, but I regret that he only got to see a rough draft before he passed. I'll be sure to post about it when it's finished. R.I.P. William Crain II, 1938 to 2024. So that is what Brian reported to us a few days back. As to this point, Tracy, I've seen no other mention online of William Crain's passing, which I guess in a way is a little bit unfortunate that he's been forgotten. He was a very talented director, did a great job in putting Blacula together. And as Brian Forrest himself told us the first time we had him on as a guest, it was William Crain who was the guy who really went against the producers. The producers wanted to make Blacula campy, comedy, kind of a parody, if you will. This was something that he did not like. He was very much against all of that. And he wanted it to be a very serious movie. And he encouraged his lead actor, William Marshall, who played Blacula, to play it that way. And that was the kind of actor William Marshall was. So it really fit into his bailiwick, too. And Crain deserves, I think, a lot of credit for doing that. He made it a much more respectable film than I think what the producers had in mind. And that's one of the things that jumps to mind when I think of the late William Crain.
Oh, exactly. I was quite saddened to read it as well. And you're right, Bruce. I don't recall hearing or seeing anything else online pertaining to this. I would think that it would have been a little bit more broadcast. But I really enjoyed the movie Blacula, and I'm really looking forward to Toothpicking's documentary that will be coming out next year. So,
yeah, it'll be at a film festival 2025, maybe multiple film festivals. It's a project he's been working on for a while, and I think it's very deserving. It'll be a nice tribute to William Crain. If you see his IMDb page, they list his birth date as much later, like 1945 or 1946. But as Brian Forrest points out, he was actually older than that. He was born in 1938, and that made him 86 years of age at his passing. So we remember William Crain, director of the cult classic film Blacula. And then, Tracy, one other topic to talk about on a lighter note. This was something very interesting revealed in late August. There was a new horror movie that was shot partially in Cooperstown back in 2021. I had no idea that this happened. I had not heard anything about it until the news came down that this new movie, which is called Stream, now available on Shudder. Now, Stream is a slasher film. The producer, writer, and actor who's in it, Jason Levy, talked about it in an article that went into syndication. And this is very interesting. The movie has some huge horror actors in it. Jeffrey Combs from the Reanimator film series, the great Dee Wallace. She was in Cujo, E.T., The Hills Have Eyes. Also Tony Todd, who was so great in the Candyman films. So they were all apparently in Cooperstown. And I have no idea how this escaped me. I mean, I was here in 2021. We live, kind of on the outskirts of the village. They must have been filming this at 4:15 in the morning, because I would have noticed if Dee Wallace, Jeffrey Combs, and or Tony Todd were walking around Cooperstown.
Oh my gosh, I would think so. And that's huge news, especially, like in the film industry. I mean, my gosh, you've got like the mom from E.T. and you have the Reanimator. Like, you would recognize these people.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, absolutely.
huge news.
Now I'm thinking maybe because this was still in the pandemic era, as things were starting to fade a little bit, starting to get back to normalcy. So maybe because of that, they were doing all interior shots and keeping things very quiet. But again, I didn't know anything about it until now. Here's what the film is about. It's a slasher about a distant family that tries to reunite by going on vacation to a remote hotel. And according to Jason Levy, who's very much involved in this as a producer, writer, and actor, the filmmakers wanted to be creative with the direction. They didn't want it just to be a straight slasher. They wanted there to be some thought, some substance behind the film also. Interesting connection. Jason Levy, who is heavily involved in this movie, is married to a Cooperstown native, Alexandria Johnson. We know her as Alex Johnson. I know Alex. She lives in Cooperstown, or at least is from Cooperstown. And she is the daughter of Jim J.V. Johnson, the guy who used to run Scaricon at the Turning Stone Casino in Verona, New York. So small world there as well. And Alex every year would help Jim, her father, run this convention. It was a lot of fun. There's been some talk recently that convention may be coming back, but haven't heard really anything more than some hints and rumors at that. But hey, I know Alex Johnson. She is married to Jason Levy, who is involved in this project. Just wonderful that they decided to do a film in Cooperstown. Not the entire film, but apparently significant parts of it. And it was done 3 years ago. The movie is now out. It did air at the Oneonta Theater for one weekend, but now it is available for those who have a Shudder. So it's out there. It's called Stream. It's got excellent reviews. The ratings on IMDb are somewhere in the 6 to 7 star range. And most of the reviews that I've read online have been pretty positive. So, hey, that's a great thing for our little town here in upstate New York.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm actually looking forward to seeing the film. I've been reading a little bit about it since you mentioned it, and it actually looks quite great. So that'll be on my watch list over the next few days.
Of course, earlier we talked to Kyle Carvin, who is a native of Oneonta, 22 miles from Cooperstown. And he has done films in Oneonta and also has done some filming in Cooperstown as well. So it's fascinating to me that our small town, rural upstate New York, is becoming somewhat of a new hotbed for horror, if you will. So it's all part of a developing situation and one that we'll continue to keep an eye on. But we're certainly excited about it here. And already they've been doing a lot of filming in your area in Nova Scotia. So I guess we're trying to catch up to that, Tracy.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Nova Scotia is kind of like a, little mini Hollywood, I guess. We've got a lot of productions on the go, at any time of the year. So there's lots of Hallmark films. There's, there was Haven, which was a Stephen King miniseries.
Mm-hmm.
that was filmed in Nova Scotia. And of course, if you're a fan of the Trailer Park Boys, that was all Nova Scotia. And yeah, there's just so many great things and definitely way more to come. So,
have you ever tried to venture onto one of these film sets to see what's happening?
Oh, I would love to, but they're several hours driving away.
Yeah.
So if one really strikes my fancy, I might try to sneak up on one of those. You just never know.
Well, I'm hoping that now we have this podcast, that the next time they do filming in Cooperstown or Oneonta, maybe they invite me to come out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that would be so cool.
I would only require a small speaking role, maybe a cameo, that sort of thing.
I think a cameo would be superb.
Yeah. I would be most satisfied just to be able to sit on the sidelines and watch. I think that would be a lot of fun. Well, Tracy, we thank you for joining us once again on the podcast. Appreciate all of your effort. We thank our guest, horror author Brandon Wills. We thank all of you, our listeners, for joining us right here in this Museum of the Macabre. And we hope to see you again very soon in the Ghostly Gallery.